This is the Spokane Soccer Show, and I am your inspired host, Benji Wade. On today's show, no matter where I go, amazing soccer seems to follow. And my conversation with Athlone Town midfielder Abby Carchio and Zephyr FC defender Sydney Cummings. Abby and Sydney also host an invaluable podcast together called Megged. But first, let's catch up a little, my lovely listeners. As you can tell, if you're watching this on YouTube or if you're watching any video content from this podcast episode of the Spokane Soccer Show, I'm in my new setup. It's the Spokane Soccer Show headquarters, aka my home office. I also want to mark the occasion. This is also the first day of the Super League Soccer Show takeover. That's why Abby and Sydney are going to be on the podcast. If you know, you know. If you don't know, I'm going to tell you right now. I am going to be doing a series of podcasts where we cover Super League content. Of course, specifically, we're going to talk a lot about Spokane Zephyr FC and Abby Carchio, my friend. You're going to meet her soon, along with her friend, Sydney Cummings, who's a new signing as a defender for Spokane Zephyr FC. We're going to be talking so much about Zephyr FC, the players that have been signed, the Super League, so much more. Can't wait. Let's get started. This is going to be a long episode, but I think you'll forgive me because I'm so excited. This is why I'm saying I'm inspired. Look at my little setting I've got here. I'm going to have so much fun talking about soccer for a couple hours tonight. I'm recording this on Friday. What is today? Friday, July 19th, the day that Spokane Velocity are going to be playing Central Valley Fuego in the Jägermeister Cup at 8 o'clock, and it's 4:30. So I'm going to try to get all this content served up and ready to go so I can watch that game. Anyway, let's get cracking. I have a bunch of updates. I'm going to catch people up on what I've been up to for the last couple weeks. So I'm going to do that right now. My summer of travel started like this. My wife and I and our two daughters were going to Whidbey Island. We knew this was coming, and I knew looking at the calendar when I saw this date, I was worried I was going to miss out on a lot of soccer, but I did sneak in some Euros. I did sneak in a few games from Copa America, and most importantly, I did get to see the Velocity FC's 2-1 win over Chattanooga Red Wolves. And I know 3,825 of you watched it without me, but I just have a few things I want to share. I know that game was a couple weeks ago, but give me a break. I've had this on my mind ever since. So what happened in that game? Second half of the loss to Northern Colorado in the Jägermeister Cup, the 3-1 loss, Lee Veidman brought on Cameron Miller to start the second half with a back three, right? So it looked like to me, and it was later confirmed, to be a 3-4-3. What does that mean? 3 defenders, 4 midfielders, 3 attackers, okay? That means you still have the double pivot. You've got Andre and Colin sitting in front of the center backs, the 3 center backs. And then the other 2 of the midfielders are the wing backs, which in this case is Derek Waldeck on the left, Javier Martin-Hill on the right. The most famous example of this formation in my lifetime, and probably the lifetime of a lot of my listeners, was Antonio Conte's 2018 Premier League winning Chelsea side. Very famously, Nemanja Matic and N'Golo Kante were the double pivot. Marcos Alonso was the left wing back. Victor Moses was the right wing back. That team had so much success, and they were so much fun to watch. We'll see tonight in the Central Valley Fuego game if Veidman sticks with the 3-4-3. Kind of hope he does, because I'm going to say I think I like what I'm seeing so far. In the game against Chattanooga Red Wolves. Or no, I'll go back even further. I was moaning a bit to my friend Scott Linklater the last time we recorded a podcast together, where I was talking about Nico Brown's goal for Lexington SC in that game. Okay, the game that we tied, we quote unquote tied. We should have won. There was a incorrect offside call in that game. But Nico Brown scored this like really, really gorgeous goal. Creates a little bit of space. I think Ahmed Longmire was defending him. Cracks the shot from left side of the box. Pings off the top of the bar, goes down across the goal line. And I'm like, why can't we score a goal like that? You know, I prayed in that podcast. Can we please score one of those? Well, prayers asked, prayers answered. Luis Hill's goal, the game-winning goal against Chattanooga Red Wolves. If you haven't seen it as many times as I have, I encourage you to catch up. I've watched it at least 150 times at this point. In fact, Luis posted it again today. I don't blame you, Luis. If I scored a goal like that, I'd post it probably every 3 days. I just want to break down this goal and why it was so incredible. Ahmed Longmire in this new 3-4-3, okay? Ahmed's constantly getting forward in the attack anyways and providing a lot of passing. Both center backs, it's kind of a feature of the way that this team plays, that low tempo, a lot of possession, right? Ahmed picks out a run from Luis Heel running down the right channel, and he pings like a 30-yard ball, and it bounces outside the box into the path of Luis Heel's run, right? But Luis Heel still has so much work to do. He turns his shoulder and gathers himself as the ball is coming into his path. He basically goes across his body with his right leg to receive the ball and strike it with his right foot. And it was one of those moments where I honestly don't blame the Chattanooga Red Wolves goalkeeper, TJ Bush. Like, the dude doesn't even move. He had this expression because it just goes right into the side netting on the far post. Clean in, doesn't even touch anything. He doesn't even really make a move. And he has this expression after the goal, this goalkeeper. He looked like somebody had just served him a plate of poop for dinner. His face just had disgust and disbelief. And again, I don't blame him. It was an absolutely astonishing goal. It was so audacious to even try from that angle. I know that the goalkeeper and all the defenders were expecting a cross. Nope. Luis just cracks it on a kind of a half volley. Thank you very much. We finally got a goal like that. All right. We finally score a beautiful goal from a low XG opportunity. I would say the XG on that shot was probably like 0.05, meaning 5% of the time a ball struck from an angle like that ends up in the back of the net. Final XG on that game was 2.56 for Velocity, 0.62 for Red Wolves. That's what you want to see. However, I will just point out, someday, please, for the love of God, I would love to see us outperform our XG, which can happen. A lot of times you can score more goals than your XG. It's allowed, Velocity. Let's start scoring some goals. Anyway, most our goal attempts this year have actually been high XG attempts, which my friend John Morrissey, USLTactics.com, has brought up recently. John, if you don't know who this is, follow him on Twitter. That's where he does most of his commenting on things that are going on in soccer and links to his articles that he's writing. He is a former scouting and data analyst for Tampa Bay Rowdies and Sacramento Republic. He's also the current co-host of the USL Show, which is on the Protagonist Podcast Network. Recommend all the Protagonist podcasts, very much so the USL Show. And in John's recent Substack article, he called it the Midsummer League One Vibe Check. And he pointed out the following, and I'm going to quote John on this directly. All right, here we go. Here's what John had to say about Spokane Velocity. At a macro level, this team is so fascinating because of their inability to finish in spite of unmatched shot quality. Spokane has averaged 0.14 XG per shot, which is first in the league by a comfortable distance and 2.6 standard deviations above average. Now, listen, I am no mathematician, but that sounds like a lot. 0.14, so 14%. The quality of our chances is at 0.14, like 14% of the time, on average, the chances that we're getting would see the back of the net. But we are very much, as I mentioned earlier, underperforming our XG. Okay, so just a quick note. I wanted to share that with everybody. Once again, John's Substack, USLTactics.com, that's his website. In that same League One Vibe Check article, he also talks about Wiedmann's move to a 3-4-3 and the impact that it's had on wing play specifically. And just a little hint for you, like the rest of us, John is a fan of number 30 and specifically Masongo Akale's partnership in like overlapping runs with Derek Waldeck on the left. So, all right, that's my update for what happened to me when I went to the first leg of my summer adventures. Leg 2 is next. Last Christmas, my sister bought for me for Christmas. I'm going to actually call it a Christmas, a Father's Day, probably a few birthdays. There's a lot that's going to be rolled up into this because she bought her and I tickets to watch Blink-182 in Portland at the Moda Center, and she went all out. We didn't just go see Blink-182 at the Moda Center. All right, I'm just going to level with you here. We also had VIP access. I also got to meet Travis Barker. It was pretty damn cool, I'm not going to lie. Anyway, so this was really exciting for me, but as I've mentioned, soccer just keeps chasing me. First, I land in Portland. I fly over early in the morning, and I knew that the WPSL West Region semifinal was going to be happening, right? And I saw the Spokane Shadow Instagram page share that there was going to be a live stream of the game. And I'm like, I can't outrun soccer. Wherever I go, amazing soccer just chases me. So, of course, I watch our 2-0 win over the San Francisco Nighthawks, the great and peerless Marissa Garcia. You've heard that name enough times by now. If you're new to the podcast, just go Google Marissa Garcia. She scores a goal in stoppage time in both halves, and Spokane Shadow go on to win their semifinal 2-0. In the middle of the game, my video stream died, so it was awesome. I'm like hanging out with my sister. She was actually super cool about this. Shout out my sister, Shelly. Love you. I'm getting live updates via text from men's Shadow first team head coach and friend of the podcast, Mike Policio. And he's like telling me they've got the game wrapped up. They score the second goal and they're dominating. And I'm just like, awesome. What a great way to start the trip. But later that night, I get to go to the Blink-182 concert, which was very cool. Get to meet Travis Barker. Incredible, one of the best rock drummers of all time, punk or otherwise. And one thing that's kind of funny about that is like all these dudes are my age, which kind of felt a little interesting. I don't know that any or all of them or have grown up at all. Anyways, I've known this band since I was like a dirtbag teenage snowboarder living in Anchorage, Alaska. I saw them at a show with Pennywise way back in the 90s, and they were called Blink at the time. This is before they changed their name to Blink-182. I think my sister looked this up. There was like some trance or techno band in like, I don't know, Austria that was called Blink, and they sent a cease and desist and I don't know, some legal stuff, whatever. Anyway, so I stayed up pretty late that night, but I did set my alarm because I wanted to watch the Euro final between England and Spain, and I did that. And I watched it from the Independent Sports Bar in Portland. If you've been, you know, great place to watch games. There's like at least 30 televisions in this place and great beer on tap. Here's a few takeaways about the game. And I know people have heard enough takes about Spain and England, but maybe you want to hear what I think. Here's what I'll say. Spain and their coach, Luis de la Fuente, okay, trusted their young wingers. England looked like they wanted to counterattack, but it's like Bukayo Saka was the only player out there that was kind of capable of getting in behind the Spanish defenders, especially on the left with Cucurella, who was like playing like, you know, intergalactically above his typical level of play. I think as a Newcastle supporter and as somebody who actually wanted to see this England team win, it would have been nice to see Anthony Gordon at some point on the left. What are we doing, Gareth Southgate? I love Gareth Southgate, and I think he did a great job as England manager. I think it was time for him to move on, but I think Gordon played 6 minutes total in the tournament. I also think he probably should have started, this is Southgate I'm talking about, he should have started Ollie Watkins because Harry Kane quite literally couldn't do anything. Lost most of his duels. I think I looked at one point. He had won 2 of 9 duels. He wasn't dropping deep to help the defense. He wasn't doing the typical thing that he did for all those years with Tottenham where he would help spring Mora or, you know, Heung-min Son with those counterattacks. I realized Southgate was never going to bench Kane, but I think in retrospect, he probably should have. He wasn't even keeping both center backs occupied. Anyway, meanwhile, here I am to paint a picture at this sports bar in Portland. I'm sandwiched between two English families, okay? Father and son, Chelsea supporters on my left, right? Father is probably my age, maybe a little older. Son is like early 20s, drinking age apparently, because he was knocking them back, folks. On my right, Liverpool supporter and his wife. And in the middle of it, after they gave up that first goal to Spain, okay, I noticed that they start bickering at each other. And I could swear they didn't even hear each other because they're like talking about it. They're like arguing about the royal family and whether or not they should even, just all these things. And I was like, come on, can we just watch football? The game finishes. This kid slams the bar top on his way out. He was devastated. My sister, who's kind of a weirdo, like me apparently, was paying a lot of attention to what was going on and could tell that he was like she even saw, I'm like, what are you doing, my sister? She's like reading this kid's text. She saw him saying some things like, we're never going to win one. It's never coming home. I'm like, oh, this is like a really kind of a sad way to end it. But come on, congrats to Spain. They were by far the best team in the tournament, by far the best team in the final. Okay, my last update about watching soccer while I was on my travels this summer so far. Spokane Shadow's WPSL team is then in the West Coast West Coast Conference region final, and I'm on my way to the airport. And I'm like, am I going to be able to watch this? In the Uber on the way to the airport, I start the stream and I'm fired it up and I'm watching. I get to the airport. My sister, because she flies so much, it's crazy. She's like the up in the air George Clooney character, has like 10 million miles. She's going to be that person someday. But she has access to their little secret handshake lounge where they give you drinks and shit like that. And I have a couple beers and I'm watching this game with my sister. It's really fun, actually. She was enjoying me kind of freaking out and sweating and having a beer, you know. Anyway, the Shadow end up giving up a goal and I'm freaking out. They're playing against the number 1 ranked California Storm, who happen to be the 4-time WPSL national champions. Our friend Gianna Riley, if you know, you know. That's the team that she plays for, but she's actually, you know, away on U.S. national team under 20 duty, where they beat Mexico 3-0, and she assisted one of those goals, I want to point out. Shout out Gianna Riley. Good job by you. So this was always going to be a very difficult challenge, but what a game. Back and forth. Every time Storm scored, Shadow would equalize. At the end of 90, it's 1-1. Chelsea assisted Marissa Garcia on the first goal. Both teams score in extra time. I'm just sitting there going, this is the most entertaining thing. I have a really weird view. I think they shoot these things with an iPad and then upload it to this stream. So I had it was like watching, I don't even know, ants might be bigger. When they were on the far side of the pitch, I couldn't see anything. I had no idea what was going on, and I didn't have anybody there at the game to give me updates. So I was just kind of squinting. Actually, Drew Williams, shout out head coach Drew Williams. He gave me a couple updates at one point because I asked him a question. I was like, are we in extra time right now? And he's like, yeah, he confirmed. It goes to penalties. And I'll just, you know, skip to the end. They lose 6-5 on penalties, but let's keep this upbeat. Congratulations, Coach Drew Williams. All these players, you were an absolute joy to watch. This whole experience of watching these several games that I got to see of the Spokane Shadow WPSL team with lots of my friends that I've been following for a while, including Chelsea and Marissa and Kaya and a bunch of new players that I've never seen before, Becca Skinner, Aaron Ewers, who will be playing with Gonzaga, Jenna Warner. I could go on. I should go on. I apologize for not mentioning more of you, but this was almost reminiscent of when I was following Gonzaga at the end of last year and just kind of stumbled upon this like historically great team. This was a historically excellent Shadow WPSL team. I don't know. I'm waiting to hear from the coaches as to whether or not they've ever had a better year than this. I don't know. Have they gone further? Have they won the West Region, bracket before and gone on to play in the national brackets against other regions? I don't know. Anyway, I will say this though. I'm happy that the players get to rest now. Like Chelsea and Marissa get to, take some time off before they start their seasons with Gonzaga, along with Aaron and Abby Cecilia and Michaela Warner. I did meet a lot of new friends though, and it was super fun. I look forward to following their soccer journey. So all of you who started following the Spokane Soccer Show recently, I look forward to hearing from you in the future. So I'm back in Spokane now, but soccer is showing no signs of slowing down. Speaking of head coach of the men's first team from Spokane Shadow, Mike Policio, his Shadow team is playing in the Evergreen Premier League playoffs. If the Shadow win this weekend against Yakima United, Yakima? I always say that city wrong. People get mad at me. Yakima. If they beat Yakima United and Surf win against the Everett Jets, we will have an all Spokane final next weekend. Everett are the number 1 seed, so if they do win, they will host. Otherwise, if it is an all Spokane final, Shadow will host. So that's what I have been up to since the 4th of July. Let's take a quick break. When we return, it's the first day of the Super League Soccer Show takeover, and we're going to hear my conversation with Abby Carchio and Sydney Cummings. Abby Carchio, Sydney Cummings. This has happened. I almost can't believe it. I'm going to start with, I got to get my listeners to know who the two of you are and your significance, which is massive to me. And I think it's going to be massive to the city of Spokane as they get introduced to you two. Abby, you have played professional soccer. All right, let's count this off. In Lithuania, Iceland, France, Denmark, most recently, Republic of Ireland. Your clubs have included Saint-Etienne in the Premier League in France. I'm going to try to get the pronunciations correct. And Athlone Town in the Republic of Ireland's Women's National League, right? Most recently?
Yes, sir.
Sydney, you have played in the United States in the NWSL for 2 clubs. You've Racing Louisville and San Diego Wave. You've played in Australia's A-League for a team called Western United, right? and most recently in the Scottish Women's Premier League for Celtic FC.
Yes.
Did I get all that correct?
Spot on.
Okay, welcome to the Spokane Soccer Show, my friends. We have some backstory, so I wanted to just start by issuing your bona fides, and then I think we owe it to the listeners of the Spokane Soccer Show in this community to tell them about our backstory, and I'm going to embellish that backstory to make it sound like we've been best friends for 10 years. That's not true. However, because I have this like parasocial relationship to the two of you, I've listened to many of your podcasts. I think between the two of you, you've probably listened to 20 minutes of mine. I take zero offense. Your podcast is way more important than mine. I'm like a little bit starstruck right now talking to you. I can't even look at your faces. I started this podcast in October of 2023 with my friend Jay. We started that whole thing. I got obsessed with the Gonzaga women's soccer team. And I think, and this has been my assumption, and we're going to learn some things together here in front of my listeners. I think it was because I hashtagged our content, women's soccer, NCAA women's soccer, college women's soccer. I don't remember. I was attempting to build an audience for the Spokane Soccer Show, and I got followed by this podcast called Megged. And I was like, hey, awesome. Followed you back, started listening to your podcast, got pretty stoked about it. Do either of you remember following the Spokane Soccer Show and or why you followed? Let's start there. Our backstory.
Absolutely. First off, Benji, we are friends and we are also starstruck because we are massive fans of your podcast. Let's just put that on the record, first of all. So yes, I definitely remember our origin story quite well because we were doing something similar in terms of trying to build our audience. And we also had no idea what we were doing when we first started Meg. So we were like, let's just follow other soccer podcasts. And so we went on a massive hunt, definitely used hashtags to find those. And so you were part of a collective of different soccer podcasts we followed. And then we realized that yours was actually legit and we like loved your energy and your graphics and what you're talking about. And we loved how you centered women's soccer in some of your pods. And so we were just like, this guy's rad. And then we connected through DMs, I'm pretty sure.
It was. And in fact, at one point, I remember mansplaining to one of you, I'm actually going to assume fairly safely it was Abby, some tips and tricks for how to build the following of the Megged podcast.
Yeah. I actually remember that.
And that was
it definitely was me. It's funny though, because Sid and I both have access to our Instagram. And so like sometimes Sydney would respond in a conversation that I was having with you. And then I'd be like, Sydney, did you respond to Benji? And then, so it was like half me, half Sydney, but I was definitely the one that was like actively asking about growing a pod. So I appreciate those words of wisdom.
I want to turn the clock back a little bit to January and February. So the Gonzaga women's season ends, and I'm like staring down like a few months before Spokane Velocity get going, and then many more months before Spokane Zephyr get going. And I remember I went on vacation to Costa Rica, and there were 4 podcasts in particular that I downloaded. And it was so much of an education that you two provided me with, so many insights. The titles of these podcasts were, should the NWSL keep the draft? What's the deal with promotion and relegation? What the heck is a transfer window? And this is my favorite, the USL Super League, the NWSL has competition. Do the two of you remember those podcast episodes? Let's start there.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's funny to hear the titles being read back to us because it like sparks back memories of when we recorded it, what we were thinking at that time, what we were talking about, what our goal was. So very different for all of them. Like sometimes we just wanted to talk about our own thoughts. Other times we were like, hey, a lot of people don't actually understand the fears of transfer windows. We're both dealing with them right now. Like, let's just talk about it. So definitely remember all of those. But I think probably the USL one was the most fun out of all of those because we didn't have a ton of information at that time when we recorded it, but we were just so big on the fact that like, this is really going to shake up women's football in the US. And we just felt like no one was talking about it. I think we said it in the podcast, like it was such an elephant in the room that no one was talking about this relationship between the USL Super League and the NWSL. So definitely remember those episodes.
And there's a lot of overlap between those episodes. So there were some things about the transfer window one and definitely the one about the NWSL draft, which, look, we could try to do the I think that the two of you do a segment where you try to have your hot takes where you disagree with each other. And I could tell sometimes it's a struggle for the two of you to disagree. I would also profoundly struggle to disagree with you when it came to those topics, because one by one, I'm like, the style of play that's happening up throughout both the men and women's game, but specifically because of your podcast in the women's game overseas. Should the NWSL keep the draft? Hint for all my listeners. First of all, I always encourage my listeners to go listen to those podcasts, but it's like, no, they should not. It's a coercive arrangement and it's awful. As a person who believes in the freedom of like choice when it comes to labor, I'm totally anti-draft. But there was all this overlap between those episodes. And I remember going on these, trying to stay in shape while also indulging myself on vacation in Costa Rica, and listening to your podcast and taking so many notes in the middle of my walk. So I pull up like Google Docs on my phone and I'll be like, I got to take another note. I was taking so many notes. I have like literally 3 pages of notes that we don't have time to get into on this podcast, because I just wanted to introduce everybody to the two of you. But it was so much fun. We made a plan to make a podcast together. At one point, we were waiting to find out more information about the Super League, because there were a bunch of assumptions being made about everybody who was talking about the topic. And I kind of lost track of the two of you for a little while, because the Spokane Velocity team started to play. And then this happened. So I'm just painting a picture for listeners here. We've talked on the Spokane Soccer Show with my friend Jay about, with Emma Hayes' book, Killing the Unicorn, I believe it's called, and the topic of ACL injuries, specifically how much that injury dominates the women's game. And then around this time, Abby posts an image and says something about an ACL tear. And it was around April Fool's. And I really, really prayed that it was April Fool's, because on your podcast, on my podcast, we had talked about ACL injuries so many times. And then I find out Sydney's playing for Celtic. Didn't know that. And you weren't, from what I could gather, you weren't featuring super regularly. You did score a goal as a center half. Shout out. That's no easy thing to do. But then a bunch of Zephyr signings are announced. I have an idea for a Super League show. I actually get in touch with the head of performance at Spokane Zephyr FC, USL Spokane, Josh McAllister, and I ask him, hey, can you keep an eye or ear out for anybody who might be a good fit for doing a podcast with me, right? And he says, well, you can't share this, but we may be signing a player who has a podcast. And I stopped in the middle again on one of my walks, and I was like, no, it can't be. And yes, it was. So I was sworn to secrecy. And at the time, I didn't know what was going on with either of you. I didn't even think it would have been a possibility. But the way that stars aligned, I reached out to Abby. Here we are. I just talked a lot. Do you have any thoughts about anything I just shared?
Oh my gosh, we're just reliving the past 6 months, Sid, aren't we? No, it's crazy how the universe works. I think originally we always wanted to do a crossover episode with you. And it just so happened that Sydney signs with literally your team and she's there. It's just crazy how that all happens. And also I think my ACL injury happened at a relevant time as well. You know, I'm able to kind of lean more into some of the other facets of the game, my coaching, and also doing more media stuff. So stars definitely aligned for us to collab on this pod.
It's unbelievable. As I'm talking to the two of you, Sydney is in Spokane. We haven't even met in person yet.
Yeah.
I know so many people who have, and I'm like, what the hell? I just did an intro to the podcast where I talk about I was not in town for the Chattanooga Red Wolves game where Velocity won 2-1. And you got to jump on the microphone and lead the Rumble thing.
Yeah.
My goodness. I can't believe I missed that.
Yeah. No, Abby and I were actually just talking about that. She was like, are you going to be in the studio? Like, what's the deal? And I was like, no, actually, like Benji and I haven't met yet. Like, we just haven't crossed paths. I said, I really expected him to be at the men's game, the Velocity game. And she was like, oh, he was definitely there. And I was like, no, Abs, I did the Rumble. If he was there, I would have known.
You would have known. I wasn't in town. I mean, let's turn back the clock. We know our backstory, how we got to know each other once upon a time, but your story that I know and my listeners don't know. We're gonna turn back the clock to Abby and Sydney's soccer journey. The two of you played together at Brown University. talk about that. How did you two become friends? Go ahead, and if you want to, start it with a little bit of like your club soccer history as like a young player.
Yeah, when you just asked that question about how Sid and I became friends, both of us laughed because our origin story is quite hilarious. But I'll start from my youth days. Grew up in Massachusetts, played for a club called NEFC. It wasn't one of the ECNL or whatever they are these days. It was a very average club, but loved my experience. Was fortunate enough to be driven around by my parents and tagged along were my siblings, and they were super supportive of me and allowed me to play in front of some coaches. I got recruited to Brown University, and 2 years after that, so I was 16 at the time, 2 years after, went to Brown, had my first freshman year without Sid. Was interesting to say the least. Fun transition to college soccer, but then Sydney popped into view my sophomore year.
Yeah, so I'm a year younger than Abs. So I grew up in New Jersey, very similar, played for a team, driven by my parents everywhere. Not one of those crazy teams now, like ECNL, all that stuff, like we were before that time. So bopped around different tournaments. I was a bit late in my recruiting because I kept turning down schools because they just didn't feel right. Kia McNeil, who Abby didn't have her first year, but I had all 4 years, ended up getting the job at Brown. I was her first recruit. I went to Brown. I was like, I absolutely love it here. This is where I want to go. So I came into the picture Abby's sophomore year, my freshman year. Same thing, like obviously transition's hard no matter what in college. So when you get to our origin story of our friendship, we were actually not friends initially. So it's a fall sport. You come in the summer, you're kicking it off right away before school even starts. Abby and I were just really different friends, everything. I actually ended up falling into like not the best friend group. So after that kind of just like blew up in my face, as things do when you're 18.
Let me pause you. When you say not friends, I'm reading into that. It felt almost kind of like, we were not friends.
No. Like not in that way. It was just like, we didn't talk. Like we just didn't talk.
And we played
just teammates.
Yeah, and we like played together, no issues at all, but genuinely like didn't run in the same circles, didn't like share like beyond pleasantries of like, hey, how's it going? And so it was crazy. It was just insane.
We weren't friends. Like we just like did things very separate once we stepped off the pitch. Second semester, so fall season ends. I think we ended up in like 4th that year or something like that, like really dramatic finish. Okay, you go home for Christmas, come back, and then you're in the spring season, and the spring season is a grind. Like it's absolutely terrible. Abby and I actually had a class together. So we would leave our 6 a.m. practice and we would go to the same place, and then we would sit in different parts of the classroom.
And I'm going to stop you right there because I need to tell this part of the story so Sydney doesn't sugarcoat it. I, like a regular Ivy League student, sit in the front so I can pay attention. Sydney's all the way in the last seat in the back. And so it was, I was just like, who is this girl? And we literally would walk together and then go sit in different seats. And then one time I was just like, you like just come sit in the front. And then she did. And from then on, we just fell into a pattern and we got to talking more, and we realized that we both like share some deep values, and we also just share this passion for the game of soccer. And that's really how we became deep friends. Is we would start going to lunch after class and genuinely doing what we do on the podcast and just talking about soccer.
So, I have to ask, Sydney, was Abby kind of influencing even your discipline as a student by sitting in the front, or was it just kind of a preference thing that you'd rather sit in the back?
No, it was more so like, here I was a freshman in college, Ivy League school, in a lecture hall. So I was an English major. So I was in very intimate classrooms my fall. And then the big lecture halls were very intimidating to me. I went to a small high school. So this was in a bigger lecture hall. So in my defense, I didn't sit in the last seat. I would sit a bit in the back, but on an angle so I could still see the screen. And yes, so then Abby was like, one day she was like, come sit in the front. And I was like, oh my God, this is like so good. Like you can just see everything. Everything's right in front of you. And she was
incredible.
like, so sit here now. And I was like, okay, I'll sit here now. And so then we like fell into a routine. Like we would get breakfast before, meet before, get breakfast, go get lunch after. And then we would just chat. And like Abby said, like we would literally just chat. Sometimes it would be about soccer. Sometimes it would not be about soccer. And we fell into a really good routine that then translated for like the rest of the spring, the summer. And then when we came in the fall, the next year, like we were thick as thieves. So it was just like a really cool transition to see how it was like literally nothing to like kind of friendly, then like friends. And then it was like, you could not see us apart.
A couple things, notes for listeners to educate them. ECNL, if you know basketball, it's probably the most equivalent to AAU, I guess.
Yeah.
It didn't exist when I was a kid. I didn't even know what that acronym meant 6 months ago. I've been educated thoroughly doing this podcast with people. When or how or did you even know that you wanted to go pro while in college together?
No, the answer is no. Like never at all. Not even
no shot.
Thought. I went into school thinking I wanted to be a lawyer. COVID hit my junior year. So it was like this really weird time. At that point, I'd already decided no law school, but it was like this really weird time where it was like, okay, now what? So I then went to Georgetown for my grad year, and it was at Georgetown that I decided that I wanted to keep playing. So it didn't happen for me until much later, which was a very different experience from Abby.
Did you use a year of eligibility to play at Georgetown? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So
I don't think I knew that.
Year of eligibility because of COVID and when it hit. So I graduated from Brown, but I still had another year of eligibility, and I decided not to stay at Brown and use it. I went and got my master's at Georgetown.
Okay. How about you, Abby?
Yeah, vastly different. Literally when I was 5 years old, I wrote down that I want to be a pro soccer player, and that's where I was at. Like even in college, I just still to this day love the game so deeply that I always knew, not even knowing what the professional scene looked like for a woman. I just knew that I wanted to play professionally, whatever that meant. And so yes, senior year was a bit weird because there was COVID, but I also was super injured. A lot of people don't know that I was super injured my senior year. I had 2 massive injuries. I had to get surgery on my foot right after season. Was playing through a lot of pain. And so I wasn't sure like how I would come back for that or if it was even like possible for me to go overseas. So that was a hairy time, but I always knew deep in my heart and my family always knew that I wanted to play professionally and achieve those dreams. And so, yeah, short answer is always, but that's kind of the long answer.
I see the Tobin Heath kit hung on the wall behind you. Talk a little bit about her career.
I mean, interesting right now that she's also going through an injury and doing a podcast. Basically, we're the same person. Just kidding. No.
What is her podcast called?
It's the Re-Ink podcast with Kristen Press. So
I've seen this. I need to follow this.
Yeah, it's awesome. Like definitely, I think we shouted out on our podcast as well, like super informative. I respect both of them so much. They're doing things beyond just the game. So, but Tobin Heath, my favorite player of all time, men or woman. I love the way that she views football as an entertainment platform. Like she goes out on the pitch and entertains and does things that no woman at the time was really doing. Rabonas, bicycle kicks, nutmegs, things that make you turn your head. And I tried to emulate that as much as possible as a player. I also just appreciate her and Kristen Press as people and what they're doing off the pitch. So that's why the jersey's up there. I still need her signature. So if she listens to this, would love that signature, Tobin Heath.
That is awesome. Okay, Sydney, I'm going to ask you to talk about Abby for just a moment here. My podcast listeners who listened to my interview with the Inlander here, there was a segment of this with Eliza Billingham, the writer who interviewed me, where she asked me a bunch of terminology, soccer terminology. And 2 of them have just come to mind because they were in the questions that she asked. One of them was techers. I get the impression that Abby has got lots of techers because I saw the keepy uppies. Despite recovering from an ACL injury, she is very early on in that recovery and still manages the keepy uppies quite thoroughly. Is that Abby? Is that your game? Sydney, is that Abby's game? I'll ask you, Sydney.
Yes. So I laughed when she was saying like all these things that Tobin Heath does because Abby does those things. She does them unapologetically. Like Abby likes to entertain when she's playing. Like it's an entertainment thing. And at the time when we were in college, like that's not what you did. And so Abby would get in so much trouble, like so often.
Okay, let's talk about Coach Kia McNeil. How did she feel about Abby's techers?
Yeah. Okay. So Kia, like we absolutely love Kia. Like we have such a good relationship with her. And like the reason why it's so funny is because like I'm a lot like Kia. Kia and I are a lot alike. Like we see the game very similarly.
Both defensive players.
Yes. Abby and Kia are not a lot alike. So like they would constantly butt heads. Like Abby tried to chip one time. She tried to chip the keeper from half field. The girl was off the line. Abby got the ball. She tried to chip the keeper. Listen, if it got off, amazing. But it was like nowhere close. And Kia would absolutely like rip into her. Abby would try to nutmeg people in games. The film would just be Abby's failure at nutmegs. Like, and it would literally, like, it's so comical now. And Abby would sit there and she would say, like, well, if that worked, that would have been great. And Kia would just clap back and be like, but it didn't. So like, you need to stop playing like this. And it was just like this constant battle of like a very traditional style. Like Kia had a very traditional, like just move the ball, use your teammates, whatever.
Pragmatic. Yeah.
And Abby was like, listen, I'm in the final third. This is my chance to be creative. If I lose the ball here, there's a million people behind me. It's okay. And so it's just so funny. But yes, Abby has techers. My other side of this story is like, you asked me, okay, like, did you ever want to play professionally?
Yeah.
Even though I made that decision at Georgetown, it's Abby's skill that gave me the ability to do that. So when COVID happened, Abby and I were roommates.
Okay.
And we both decided to stay at the university for as long as we possibly could. And every day we would go out to the field, take a bag of balls, and we would just play. Like we would just work on different things. So like it was this set amount of time. We didn't last very long at the university, like on our own. This is like beginning, like things just shut down. So I think we lasted like a week and a half, 2 weeks. But like literally every single day for hours, we were outside and she was just teaching me how to do this, how to do that, how to do this, how to do that. And so like Abby's skill is very unmatched, I would say, especially like she was probably before her time in the college game.
Okay, Abby, it's your turn to now talk about Sydney's game a little bit because we're going here. Let's go. Welcome to the Spokane Soccer Show. We go deep. Abby, what was it about Sydney's game that you observed as a player together in college that you kind of learned from?
It's not often that Sydney and I sit here and publicly talk pleasantries to each other. So this is a rare treat for each of us. I was just loving hearing those words come out of Sydney's mouth. So I guess I'll return the favor. Sydney and I are vastly different players, right? I'm very attacking minded and Sydney's very defensive minded. And so literally, I distinctly remember the first training of preseason at Brown. I went to receive the ball. There was a defender on my back, and usually I would slip through a defender quite easily. Sydney came plowing through and was up on my back, and I was like, oh, dang, like who the frick is this kid? And so that was the first taste of Sid's talent, and just her ability to 1v1 defend is unreal. Her cerebral game is unmatched. I think, again, she was definitely beyond her years in college, just the way that she could read the game before things even happened. Oddly, we talk about her looking into the stands or looking at the clouds during games because she doesn't have much to do. But I in seriousness, I do know that she is thinking through a lot more than most of us are on the pitch. But it's funny, even now, as I transition into my coaching career, Sydney is teaching me new things about defending. I actually am doing my preseason plans for my college team I'm coaching. And I called Sydney up. I said, listen, I'm doing a tactical defensive session. I need you to tell me the details that I need to integrate into this session. And so we sat on the call for 2 hours going through the weeds of that. And that's what I value so much in Sid, is that she has this domain knowledge about defense that is really rare in our game.
So Abby brings the techers, Sydney brings the steal. I think teams need both, right? I mean, that's what it really comes down to. You need some expression. We talk about this a lot on my podcast since the earliest days, because watching that Gonzaga team, there were a couple players in particular that just played with so much joy and expression. But you also need someone who can put a foot in an ass. And it takes both. So I love that there's this kind of dialectic, if you will, between the two of you and how you came together as both friends and as players. I have to bring this up because it's so freaking funny to me. The first time I ever called Abby and got her voicemail greeting. Okay. Dude, I had to like stop, and I think I literally called you back because I was like, that can't be the right number, because it sounded like a 9-year-old, but it sounded like Abby. And so I was just like, oh, what the hell, man? It feels weird to even be leaving a voicemail in case I got some random kid.
Hi, this is Abby Carchio. I'm not here right now, so just leave me in your name and number. Bye.
Oh my God.
And then all right, I want Abby to now tell our listener what in the hell I heard, because it was so funny to me.
You didn't hear a 9-year-old. You heard a 13-year-old getting her first phone and leaving her first voicemail receiver and never changing it until I still haven't changed it to this day. And Sydney knows this because I send her to voicemail all the time. And you know, Benji, when you sent a voicemail afterwards saying, I don't even know if this is you, it cracked me up because my father reminds me quite often, probably weekly, that I need to change that voicemail because I'm not going to get a job as a coach. So,
dude,
it's
such a commitment. It's such a commitment. It's such a great bit. I hope you stick with it forever. I don't understand it because I kind of agree with your dad. I'm like,
it will be changed. I just haven't gotten around to it. Maybe this is the driving force, the impetus for me to change it, but makes for a great icebreaker and a great story, I think.
It really does. And it also made me think like, oh my God, if the first time I got a phone, it was like in the 1930s. Anyway, so let's move on. I want to talk about this segue from the two of you playing together college soccer to playing as professionals. All right. So I've heard this from the two of you before on your podcast and through our conversations that COVID had a big impact. Abby started her professional career first. Talk to us a little bit about some of the clubs that you've played for. And start with you, Abby.
Yeah.
Where did you go first?
So I've bopped around quite a bit in my 4 years playing professionally. The first two contracts were, we'll call those stepping stones. My first contract was in Lithuania, of all places. Couldn't even label that on a map, but it turned out to be an awesome experience for me. Was with a great group of girls. Shout out FK Gintra. That's it. Yeah, and so we wore these nice yellow jerseys, and it was such a strange experience, but it was exactly what I needed at the time. I then went to Iceland, which was a really difficult point in my career. It wasn't a good fit. I had an agent that didn't do right by me, in my opinion, and that was short-lived, probably 6 months, and I was done with that contract. Went home, had a gap in playing for about 6 months, purely because I couldn't find a team to play on. But then, you know, you call it the universe. I landed a really good agent, and he got me onto a team in Division 1 of France called Saint Etienne, where I did my majority of my career, and I would say is definitely the peak of my professional playing. There are a lot of ups and downs there. I'm not going to say it's all great, but I value that experience so deeply. Learned French, made a lot of great friends, probably played my best football, and about 3-4 months ago, went to Denmark first. I forget about that. It was such a short amount of time. But we don't like to speak about Denmark on Megged that much. Couldn't take a ton away from that experience. Wait, I want to make clear to my listeners, because I think this is really important. You just talked about yourself as though, oh, my best footballing years, like you are 26 years old. Yes, I am 26 years old, and I've talked about this on Megged a lot. Like my goals professionally, I want to coach on the biggest stage, and so I see this as one kind of crescendo. My playing career is essentially a crescendo into my coaching career, and so in regards to football and it being my peak, of course, at age 26, you would think, I got a couple years to play, but I really do see my career as a bit shorter than maybe most intend to have. And that's why I say it's my peak. That's the highest level of football I've ever been a part of. I was pushed so much there. I grew technically, tactically, and so that's why I put it at my peak. It was tough, and then obviously going to Denmark after that, I think I was at a point where I wanted to start my coaching career, and I needed to take my coaching licenses. Denmark offered that initially. unfortunately, I wasn't able to complete my coaching courses there for various reasons, but that's kind of how Ireland came up, which was a great opportunity for me to go to an English-speaking country for the first time, get my UEFA B license, and then also play at the same time. And I owe dividends to Athlone Town. They've been so good to me, even though I was only there for a short amount of time. I really enjoyed every minute I spent there. I was enjoying my football. Great group of girls, great ownership group, and yeah, can only speak praises of them. And I'm still getting my UEFA B. Should wrap it up in September, but that's kind of my 5 different clubs in 4 years for you, Benji.
Okay, but are you saying, I'm gonna ask the tough questions here. Are you saying you don't want to play anymore, or are you open-minded about playing more if like an opportunity came up and I don't know, it's like a USL Super League or something like that?
It's a very fair question. I knew this one was coming, regardless of how much time we spend offline talking, Benji. I said this to Sid. I'll always play football. I'll always be a footballer. I love the game so deeply. I find the most joy and peace just being on a pitch by myself, but also playing competitively. I don't know definitively if I would try and make it go at the USL. Right now, it's not in a, women's professional soccer isn't at a sustainable place, in my opinion. Sid and I have talked transparently about this financially, socially, even with regards to how often we move. And so definitely looking for a little bit more stability, but that doesn't mean I don't have a coaching job and I go play in a men's league competitively on the side. I think that's the trajectory I'll go for, but I will say this, Benji, I am rehabbing this knee as if I'm coming back to play professionally. What happens after those 9 months is up to the universe, really.
Okay. All right. Sydney, what was your first professional club experience, and like how much did Abby share as you went through the steps of becoming a pro player in Europe yourself? Kind of sounds like it's analogous to what happened for you in college. You got there a year before, and Abby got to tell you some things that she learned along the way.
So Abby was really good for me because it was just like sharing information, like here's what to look out for. So I was at Georgetown when my agent reached out to me and was like, listen, I've been following your career since Brown. I'd really love to represent you. So I took a very different path than Abby. I decided to try domestically first. I've talked about this on the podcast. If I could do it over again, I don't regret it. Yeah. If I could do it over again, I would do it differently. I just think I didn't really understand how political the NWSL is and like how different it is than just being like, okay, go play some soccer. So I got drafted after Georgetown. I got drafted to Racing Louisville. And that was a incredibly tough experience for me. One, being in Kentucky, no car, no friends. Like I was still finishing my master's online. So I was there in the dead of January. Like it was just like a really hard experience.
What year was this, Sydney?
2022.
Yeah.
Okay.
January 2022.
Thank you, Abby.
Yeah. So plus it's like the most competitive football I've played at this point. Like that jump from college to professional is so big. Like it's so massive.
We talk about this all the time on the podcast. I don't think people understand the gulf between college soccer and professional soccer. Grown ass human beings. It's a lot different.
Yeah. It's also really crazy because like every time you get to like a different level, like if you think of it like a pyramid, like it just keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So you go from at a top college program being one of the best to then going to a professional team. And it's like everyone was either the same or better than you were. So it's like you really just keep like every time you go to the next level, you go from like the top to the bottom, the top to the bottom. And like that was really difficult for me to wrap my brain around. So Louisville was great in terms of the exposure, the learning experience, the level. Didn't have the best experience in terms of where I kind of fell with the team. So I've been really honest about this. Being drafted doesn't mean you get signed. So I was there for the entire preseason. And it was literally the last day before they had to finalize the roster. I got called into the office. First time I ever had a conversation with the coach. He said, how are you finding it? I said, good. I think, I think I've grown a lot. I struggled a bit in the beginning. I've grown. He said, I completely agree. Unfortunately, we're not going to sign you. And so that was like a massive, like, whoa, what the heck? I really wasn't expecting that because why did you just keep me here for so long? Spoke with a lot of the older players and they just really reaffirmed to me like, listen, this is the political stuff with playing professionally that you don't necessarily deal with in college. If you weren't good enough, you wouldn't have been here for the entire preseason. And so that really just solidified to me that I still wanted to give it a try. Then had a weird limbo period where I was kind of waiting at home. I didn't feel super comfortable with the idea of going overseas. I didn't really understand transfer windows at that time. It was like really wishy-washy. And then I got my big break with San Diego Wave. So with the NWSL and FIFA windows and all of that stuff, national team replacement contracts. We've talked about this a bit on the podcast, but it's basically like during a FIFA window where there's an international tournament, the players can be signed in the NWSL for like short-term contracts. So I got flown out to San Diego for like a 5-day trial. I was training with 3 injured players, one of which was Abby Dahlkemper. So I literally was like, oh my God, this is
that's awesome.
Insane. And I got
Wait, can
signed.
I pause you? I'm going to pause you real quick, Sydney. I just want to make sure, because this was confusing to me at first, and now I understand it. So, because you yourself were a national team replacement player, that basically means like when a player from a club goes on international duty for a certain amount of time, a player can be signed to fill in for that player at a club. So someone from San Diego Wave, you probably even remember who, made they got international a call up, and that it meant that San Diego FC was allowed to sign somebody for that amount of time, and it comes with all these different stipulations, and it's very collectively bargained stuff. But yeah, is that effectively what happens?
Yeah, basically. So, and even that was like really lucky for me because it was the CONCACAF tournament. And so Naomi Girma got called up with the US. The reason why I was eligible is because I play for Guyana. So my dad is Guyanese. I play for the Guyanese national team. We got knocked out of that tournament. So like, it's all really weird where it's like, if I didn't get knocked out, I wouldn't have been I wouldn't have been eligible. Like,
I'm glad you said that, because I was going to say you've been capped. So it's interesting. Okay. Timing wise. Okay.
Yeah. So all of that stuff, like half of it's chance. Abby and I talk about this all the time. Like some of it's just dumb luck. So I ended up with San Diego. My contract expired and they asked me to stay. They said, you're a really big asset to the training environment. We really want you to stay. Like, we're looking at potentially signing you for next season. I was like, absolutely, I'll stay. Like, what else am I going to do? While I was there, my agent got a call. There was a team expanding in the A-League. The A-League and the NWSL have had a really good relationship over the past couple of years. And so, I had
A-League, for listener, first division women's soccer and men's soccer in Australia.
Yeah. So I had this opportunity to go. And in my head, it was like, listen, I'm not getting paid anymore for San Diego. It's a great training environment. I learned so much, but like, this is actually what I'm trying to do. And I'd given the NWSL a shot. I didn't love it. And so I was like, listen, this is kind of what I want to do. Went to Australia, had an absolutely amazing time there. In the inaugural season, we actually finished in second. So that was really great. Met great people, some of my best friends, learned so much, had an opportunity to resign. And I was like, you know what? No, like I want to try something new. I want to try something else. Came back to San Diego for the summer. And I was there again, national team replacement player, playing, training, learning. And then for lack of a better words, I had something fall through. Abby and I have talked about this as well, where you think things are going to happen, you put things in place and then they don't. So I had actually signed a contract for a team in Europe and it fell through. And it put me in a really tough position where I had left San Diego. So I terminated my contract early with San Diego. I was now stuck back home and the window was about to close.
Oh.
I reached out to literally every team I possibly could.
This is why, real quick interjection, this is why everybody needs to listen, listeners, to what the heck is a transfer window, because you go over this in depth and talk about all these different limbo periods, especially as being North Americans, Americans playing and U.S. citizens playing overseas, and just the difference between the two markets and so forth. It's wild. And I can't, the things that you two have put up with during these weird transitory periods. Ugh.
Yeah, stressful. That was like probably one of the most stressful points in my career because as Abby just said, like it's not financially stable. So I was basically hitting a point where it was like, if I don't get on a team, I can't afford to keep playing. Like I have to go find a 9 to 5. So Abby and I have this terminology where we have like our panic date. And I was like nearing my panic date of like, okay, I really need to put things in place to move on.
Yeah.
And Celtic came into the picture.
Okay.
So ended up in Scotland, I was there for a season. I had a coaching change mid-season. I also got hurt. That was my first time dealing with an injury where I wasn't able to play through it. So all of those things, I think, and just Scotland is beautiful, I think, maybe to visit, but I didn't love living there just for things out of anyone's control. The weather is really hard to live through. And then USL entered the picture, and I thought, you know what, I've done the international. Logistically, it can be a bit of a headache. The idea of coming back to the States, a little bit more stability, trying something new, not having to deal with like visas and being away from home and missing all this stuff, really ignited like a fire in me to like want to do it. And then I just wanted to be a part of something amazing when I spoke to Josh McAllister, who you've mentioned, and kind of the things that they were saying. I was like, okay, I feel like this is what people who are like me, who have been like a bubble player in the NWSL, like this is what we've been waiting for.
Yep.
And so the opportunity came, I jumped on it, and I am very happy.
And you are in Spokane right now. Yeah.
Benji, I just want to say, when Sid first heard from Spokane, the fact that we knew about your show and we knew you put some legitimacy on this club. I'm not kidding. Like it really did. And so when Sid told me that, I was like, oh, like that's the podcast. Oh, well, and put two and two together. I was like, they're legit. Like they have a legit men's program. And therefore, like you would assume with the owners, like the women's program is going to be good as well. So you can put on record, Benji, and Sid, you can cooperate in this. There is an influence on Sid's decision, I would say.
Well, you said recently in our text thread that you and I manifest this to happen. And I think I'd like to believe that there's some truth in that, because I still couldn't believe the phone call that I had with Josh, where I'm like, I might be dumb enough to attempt to do a Super League soccer show. Do you know anybody out there that would be interested in being a co-host out there that's like former pro, like former coach, something? He's like, well, I know someone who's got a podcast that we're getting ready to sign. Anyway, I encourage people to listen to your podcast where you've gone in depth on some of these subjects, but I do, just in case some of my listeners don't dive in and go full unabridged on this topic, which they absolutely should, talk to me a little bit about, we'll start with you, Abby, the investment, infrastructure, working conditions as a professional women's soccer player in Europe. I will give a couple paraphrases of some things I've heard from your podcast that were like, OMG. You have to have another job because you're living paycheck to paycheck. I don't think that necessarily goes away because you're playing in the United States, by the way. You're trying to pay off student loans to Brown, trying to buy groceries. You have to pay sometimes for housing. Sydney mentioned at one time that you have been working a second job the entire time that you've played professional soccer. So just start with your experiences in Europe and what you witnessed there, and use that as like a means to maybe talk about like what you'd love to see in the continued investment in U.S. women's soccer.
I'll be careful on this topic because it does vary. It really does. Like some clubs, you know, they do invest and they give as much as they can to the women. It's not nearly as enough, but they do try. Then there are some clubs that genuinely do not try, and you are a supplementary aspect to their club. You're really just a throwaway token to say that they have a women's team. And so that bleeds through on financials. And we haven't been, we've been really transparent about it, and the fact that you are literally living paycheck to paycheck, as you said. And you definitely do need a second job, but it's more difficult. And this is why the USL is so important, is that when you're overseas and you're on a visa to play, you do not have the opportunity to have a second job in person in that country. You need an additional visa. And so that adds another layer onto it. But it's a
good point. Sydney had mentioned that the work that you were doing was remote because of this.
Yeah. And so the financials are, clear as day. And I think the other eye-opening thing coming from a Division I program in America is just the resources or lack thereof overseas that women are given, from pitches to locker rooms. These locker rooms, I've been in cleaner and nicer locker rooms when I was 8 years old in America than I've been in overseas in some clubs. And so the access to recoveries, to gyms, you're using like basements for gyms and things like that. So it's while my professional career has given me so much in terms of personal growth and football culture, it's really underserved in a lot of aspects that I just mentioned.
I think I'm quoting you, Abby, but at one point in your podcast, you said something like, it's a terrible reason to give up your dreams because of finances. Female footballers are so used to accepting so little because you have no choice. Did I get those quotes right?
I mean, I'm just going to assume yes. But yeah, that's something that I would say. And I definitely think you have quoted it correctly. That's really true for, there are different calibers of players. I'm not the Alex Morgans of the world. Those types of players, sure, they can definitely currently make a living. You have the Beth Meads of the world. I don't know what their financials are, but these players who can get endorsements, things like that, sure, there's definitely possibility to, have enough money to, secure funds for a family and whatnot. But at the caliber that I was at, I would say I'm a mid-table type of player. It's not feasible. You can barely save money on these. And I'm a penny pincher, and Sydney will tell you that. I am incredibly frugal, and it was tough for me to save. So, it's you're my back's against the wall. I do really not. I could take the choice, prolong my career, and that would definitely push the opportunity to have a family, to buy a house, do these big financial endeavors down the road. But no, it's definitely not feasible for players in my caliber to be doing that type of thing.
There was an anecdote you shared that I'd just love you to share with our listeners about. I'm assuming it was, you might not have named the club, so I won't name the club, even though I'm reading between the lines of which club it was. But these clubs that have both a men's and women's team, you told a story about youth male players. Do you remember the story, Abby?
Yeah.
And can you tell us that story?
I was at a club with a men's academy. So they have this first team, and then they also have an academy team where it has boys from 18 all the way down to about 12 years old. And we would get to go to the lunch, the cafeteria of the academy once a week on Wednesdays. And that was a privilege in itself, whereas the men eat there all the time. Mm-hmm. When it's time to go get your food, we would have to go after the U12 boys. They would let the academy boys get their food first, and then the professional women's team would go up after. And it was definitely a cultural difference, but it's also just goes to show how far off we are, and how you're treated as a second-class citizen, even below boys who haven't reached puberty yet. So that was a tough one to swallow for sure.
Sydney, what were some of your experiences like that? I'm not asking for just the horror stories. I'm just kind of curious about just describing the context. Obviously, for a lot of Americans that are familiar with the Women's Super League, it's like, that looks great. Everything's awesome. Chelsea and Barcelona sold out Stamford Bridge for their game. Like, yeah, this is great. But at other clubs, other countries, other leagues, that's not necessarily happening. So I just wanted to paint like a picture of what you experienced, because the two of you have been several places and throughout the world playing professional soccer.
For sure. I've experienced similar to Abby, where you feel like a second-class citizen. I was in a club where we were in the away locker room. So if the men had a match or anyone was coming, like, we had to vacate our locker room. So like technically it's not even yours. So even something so small, like not having a place where you can like permanently post up your stuff, like, it just like takes a bit of like a mental, emotional toll on where you feel valued. And that can be really difficult. Like when you have these facilities that the men get to use and the women are then like struggling and like asking, oh, well, can we just at least use the men's facility for X, Y, and Z, like the men's gym, for example, because like it's already a part of the club. And it's like, no, because then you'll screw up the men's schedule. Doesn't matter if they're there. It doesn't matter if they're away, like anything like that. And that can be really difficult to deal with mentally, because the things that you're asking for, it's not even like, oh, well, the men have this, so we deserve it. It's like, okay, what we have isn't enough. It's not sustainable. The club already has things in place that can make this better. We're not asking for the same thing. We're just like asking for what we have to be a bit better. And like to get pushback on that is really hard. So I have been at a club where very similar experiences to Abby, but I've actually also been at a club where I had a pretty positive experience. And that was like really refreshing in hindsight. Was it perfect? Absolutely not. Like, it's impossible, I think, to be perfect, but they really did try. And I think that shows a very positive trajectory, like you've talked about, Benji, in terms of, it's getting better and they want it to be better. And I think when you have a vision it's kind of hard with like old European clubs where like it's so ingrained in the culture that like, it's the men's club. Like it's so toxic. But when you start a new program, so like think of Spokane, like think of Velocity and Zephyr, like you're starting this thing kind of very similarly at the same time, where it's like you have the chance to be groundbreaking and do this thing where it's like very equitable. And like that is so amazing to be a part of. And like seeing, something that would be like a headache that you couldn't even ask for in Europe, but like you're literally getting it without having to ask for it here. Like I was a part of a club that did that same, like kind of had that same mentality as well. So I've actually been pretty lucky, which I'm very grateful for. But yeah, I feel like that's what the trajectory needs to go towards, like this old traditional culture. Like this is the boys club, this is the men's team, like everything like that is just like so ridiculous. And I feel like if that's the mentality you want to have, like don't have a women's club, because you're doing such a disservice to the women and then like young girls and stuff like that. But these clubs that are really trying to like build both the men and the women's side and like make it a thing where it's not even a conversation, that's amazing.
So I appreciate everything you just shared, Sydney. And I think we talked about this, I think the three of us recently. It just happened again with Manchester United, okay, on this topic of equity, not equality, right? This is that phrase has come up on your podcast before. The Manchester United men's, the club, right, that has control over the men's and women's team, they moved their far more successful women's team out of their facilities to accommodate the men's team while renovations of the men's training facilities were taking place. And they put the women's team in like trailers and stuff. Meanwhile, their new billionaire owner that everybody seems to love so much also expressed like ridiculous levels of ignorance or indifference about the women's team in recent interviews. Talk a little bit, and we'll start with you, Abby, but then I would love to hear from both of you about we want equity, not equality. What is meant by that?
It's a tough one, and I think it's language that is used frequently without discussing the logistics of it, right? Equality is asking for us to be on the same, essentially the same. And inherently, you can't be at the same when you didn't have the same starting point. In Europe and in England specifically, when we're talking about Manchester United, there was a ban on football for 50 years, right? And so your starting points are vastly different. And therefore, to ask for this complete parity is a little bit outlandish. What we're asking for is, equal investment at an equal rate of where we're at. And so right now in the Manchester United situation, no, you're not asking for them to invest the exact amount of money that they invest in the men's team, but you are asking to support them for where they're at and allow for this type of exponential growth that you allow for the other side as well. And so, that whole situation is frustrating. But in terms of the actual linguistics that we're talking about, I think they can get saturated. But really, we're just asking to be supported in a way that allows the natural growth that happened in men's football to also happen in women's football, if that makes sense.
It does.
Yeah, I think Abby touched on it really well in that. And I think with this example, the reason why it's so frustrating is because like you're taking the women out of their facility, which is already theirs, to put the men into theirs when into the women's, when in reality, the women can stay where they are and you can put the men in the cabins. Like it's like this whole musical chairs type thing. And you're disrupting the women who are coming in for a preseason, who are trying to do all the things that they're trying to accomplish. And like Abby said, you're disrupting that just for the sake of, well, the men need the better facility. And again, you're updating the facility. So what you do is your business, that's fine. But it doesn't mean that the women should then suffer because the men are getting something nicer. Like even these teams that have a women's side, like it's a boys club. Like you'll have people that strictly support the men and then actually like look down upon the women. And it's like, how can you say in this example, and I'm not saying this is necessarily true with Manchester United, but using them as the example, like how can you say you're a Manchester United fan, you rep Manchester United, if you're not giving the women like the same support that you're giving the men? And like that goes towards staff, and that goes towards owners and all of that. So I think that's where our frustration really lies. Like, you have a club that, like, well, you're kind of getting it right. The women are in great facilities, all of that, but then you like take massive steps backwards. And that's something that we've talked about a lot on our podcast. Like, for every step forward, it feels like there's a million steps backwards. And like, you're looking at these teams to potentially get it right, and then they don't. And that's like really heartbreaking.
It almost felt like it was assumed that this would happen. The way that the Ratcliffe talked about it, their new owner, of like, oh, well, of course we moved the men, like, or moved the women out and moved them there. Like, the backlash was pretty severe, though. So we can only hope that progress will result from that backlash. Okay, let's talk about what the two of you are most excited about with the women's game right now. Like 2024, July 19th. What are you stoked about with the women's game writ large?
I think for me, it's the fact that the gap is getting so much smaller between the best, and I don't want to say the worst, but like the top and the bottom, let's say. Like, I feel like for us growing up, it was such domination with the US women's national team, which obviously for like national pride was amazing. And like, to be a part of, Abby and I were at the World Cup in France in 2019, and like, wow, that was a surreal moment. But I think it's so cool to see the way that things are changing in teams. Like, we just spoke about Zambia on our podcast, and like, the way that people were talking about Zambia, I don't even know if people were talking about Zambia like 2 cycles ago. And like, we're bringing them up in conversation about the fact that like, they're really about to throw a wrench in the Olympics. And that's just because what people think of, and like the standards that we've kind of seen of football are changing so dramatically, which is absolutely amazing for exposure and culture and all of that stuff. And like, for the next generation. So for me, I love that like, we enter a tournament and we have no idea who's going to win. You have no idea who's getting out of their group. You don't know who the next star is going to be. And I think that that is amazing. It's just making it really enjoyable to watch women's football right now for me.
Oh, my eyes lit up when you asked that question, Benji, because I'm really excited about women's soccer in this specific time. I think I really missed the boat on the timeline for as a player, but I think I'm going to catch it as a coach, and I'm thrilled about that. I think the number one thing I'm most excited about is that women's soccer is being looked at as an entertainment entity in the lens of investors. I think, since 99, really in the States, we have had these amazing figures fighting for women's sport and for women's soccer specifically. And there's been a lot of talk about it, and that's amazing and necessary. But I think to really drive home getting on some sort of parity with a men's game, there needs to be money involved. Money talks. And I think it's been a long time coming that women's sports and soccer specifically is looked at as a legitimate business endeavor to get a return. And you're seeing that on these sales of NWSL teams that are amassing these great returns. That's going to increase the amount of investors interested in potential USL teams and things like that. So that's going to turn the cycle. And I think it's going to really launch us into kind of another lens or another jump in women's soccer, let's say.
At one point in your podcast, Abby, you brought up something about Arsenal, specifically the Women's Super League, and the following that club has. And it was a staggering number compared to the men's game.
So the Arsenal women's team actually has a larger revenue than 9 Premier League teams on the men's side. That's staggering to me.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about Megged. I can't believe we've gotten this far in this podcast. We haven't talked about this. What year did you start it? What was the first conversation? At one point on your podcast, you mentioned that you hadn't seen each other in like 3 years.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we started February 2023. It feels a lot longer, but...
Yeah. So what actually happened, so I was in Australia, Abby was in France, and Abs was going through like a really weird time where she just felt like, I need something more. Like it's not enough. Like football's just like, it's not enough right now. And she called me. Abby and I talk pretty much every day. She called me and she's like, listen, World Cup is coming up. I'm thinking about like freelancing, like, and writing articles for the World Cup. Obviously, Abby and I went to college together. So I know Abby's strengths and weaknesses when it comes to school. And I was like, Abby, why would you write articles when you hate writing? Like, why are you going to do this? And she was just like, no, like, I need something. She was like, I don't know what to do. At the time, I was flirting with the idea of having a podcast in general. Like, I just really liked the concept, but I had no idea what it would be about or anything like that. And I don't even know like what actually came to be, but I was tossing out ideas at her about different things to do. And she was like, well, I just like want to talk about football. Like, you and I speak every day and we just talk about the things that are happening. And then I think we were like, maybe we should just like try a podcast and see what happens. And so we did. Like, we went back and forth for a while about like logistics, about what it would be about, what the name would be, what the logo would be, like all of this kind of stuff. Abby and I are so different, so we disagreed on literally everything. And then got to a point where we were like, okay, like we can run with this.
I would love to see the deck of all the discarded ideas.
No, you don't. No, you don't. Like the amount of failed logos, the failed intro songs, like just sending music back and forth when we were like, we have such different music tastes. And she was like, I hate this. I was like, really? I love it. And she was like, nope, next. Like literally everything was being vetoed. But part of that was fun. Like that was part of the process of like creating this thing that we had no idea what it would be like. And so then we started like churning out some episodes, and the World Cup was obviously coming up. So that was a big part of like the beginning of Megged for us, highlighting the World Cup prior to it starting. And then when it actually started, like doing game reviews, and like we followed that very religiously. And it was very interesting to do that as like not just viewers, like we were literally like media about it, but like very low scale. And so that was kind of how Megged came to be. And then it was just a way for us to stay connected every week. So we were doing weekly episodes for a very, very long time, even if something happened. Like there was a period of time where Abby was traveling Europe. And so we pre-recorded episodes. So like we were very religious about this. And then we've talked a bit about Abby's ACL tear, but that was actually the first time I was in Ireland when that happened. So I was visiting Abby that weekend. And it was the first time that we were seeing each other for 3 years.
And you tore your ACL.
Yeah, I was like, oh, Sydney's coming. Got to do something dramatic.
So we'd been speaking like literally every day for 3 years, like either on the phone, on FaceTime, texting, whatever. Finally get to see each other. Like we're literally over the moon. She's like, oh, I've got this game. It's really far. So like, just hang out. I went to Galloway for the day. Like it was amazing. And then I'm back taking care of my best friend. It was like, it's fine. Like it's
Did
fine.
you hurt yourself in a game?
Yep. I was in Belfast, which was like 4 hours away from Athlone. And yeah, it was first 20 minutes and just non-contact, but it was, serendipitous, I guess, that Sydney was there that weekend, but also like, what a freaking damper I am on our time together.
We basically were like, what are the odds that this happens at this time? But then in hindsight, we're like, thank God this happened at this time, because Abby was living alone. So it was like, thank God, like, we didn't know what was happening with the playing career and, all of this stuff. So basically Megged has kind of just like been our link with each other for a while. And it's kind of served as like a great way for us to do what we would do normally, but like do it in a fun and entertaining way.
Do you both want to do something in media as when your career as a player / coach is over? Like, I get the sense, I almost want to answer for both of you, but I won't. So Sydney, do you have interest in having a media career when you're done playing?
Nope. No.
What?
Like, no. I think that,
don't understand
Megged has been really good. I've kind of always been like a speaker, and I think Megged has been pretty good to like actually have something to speak about. And I think we're really good at it. Like, I think we play off of each other really well. We just have such a good friendship, but like, it's not a desire of mine. I love our podcast. I would do a podcast forever, but no, I don't.
What? Okay. Well, what I get a sense, Abby's football for life. What about you, Sydney?
If Abby had her way, the answer would be yes. We'd be coaching together.
Yeah.
No, not necessarily.
Okay. This is interesting, because I will just say this, and I'm glad you already did, Sydney. You are very good at it. And I reserve the right to say that, not because I have a podcast, but because I have listened to way more podcasts than I would ever like to admit. And I think my listeners can tell. A lot of what I'm doing is just borrowing from the best podcasts that I've listened to. I can tell that the two of you have paid attention to the formatting, best practices, etc. You're so good at it. I will give you a note that I've never given probably about a podcast to someone, which is I feel like sometimes you could literally slow down. I've never said that. I'm such an ADHD squirrel of a person. And I typically would be I don't ever do the increase the speed to 1.2 or 1.5x or whatever, but I can't stand listening to podcasts that are poorly facilitated, where the conversation just gets stuck in mud, or two people don't know who's going to talk next, or any of those things. I'm driven crazy by it. So I'm like, clean it up. With you two, I'm like, whoa. I'm hitting rewind. And I've had people say that about my podcast before. So I'm sensitive to this, but I have had those moments where I'm like, this is so well done. It's so chock full of nutrients and information that I'm like, okay, I got to pause. What did they just say? So you're both so good at it that I actually hope you reconsider what you do with your careers, whether it's Abby said she might want to do so as a pundit. Sydney, I think you could actually literally be like a host or all those things. So anyway, I digress. I just wanted to get that off my chest that I think Megged is amazing. And everybody who's listening to my podcast and cares about the women's game, please subscribe. I don't know if you're going to continue doing it. That's a topic maybe for another day. I don't want to put you on the spot. I'll let you work that out with the club and all that other kind of stuff. But presumably you can do some version of it moving forward. Let's end on this transition period. What you're going to do next. Abby's rehabbing and has mentioned that you're pursuing your coaching. You're pursuing the UEFA B license. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Yes, I'm doing it in Ireland. So the club has been really good about that for me. The objective with that is to get my licensure kind of back to back. So hopefully I'll get into a UEFA A next year. Just steam ahead. As an American, you need some extra clout if you want to coach overseas, some more legitimacy. And so it's really important that I get those. But
is it one of those things where you could probably not bring your American license overseas, but you could bring a UEFA license here? Is that kind of how it works?
That's exactly right.
Okay. I'm somehow not surprised by that, but okay.
Coaching's definitely in my future. I picked up a job as an interim head coach in America. So I'll be doing a college season, get a college season under my belt. Excited for that this fall. And simultaneously rehabbing this knee to potentially, who knows, Benji, play professionally or just absolutely tear it up in the men's league. That has been so good to me as well.
I think the rough ballpark on the additional number of professional opportunities by the time more teams come online in the USL Super League by 2026 it's like around 300 players. And that includes many Americans, by the way, who get to come home. Sydney, talk to me about that a little bit. The opportunity to be an American professional soccer player who gets to come home and play in her country and what that means maybe to your family and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I do want to just mention, I'm pushing so hard for Abby to join this league as a coach. I think that it would be absolutely amazing. Listen,
we're going to manifest that to happen.
Absolutely. I am really excited to be back in the States. I think one of the benefits of being overseas is you get to see so many different things and immerse yourself in so many different cultures, so many different kinds of people. For me, being back in the States doesn't mean I don't get to still experience that. So a draw of Spokane to me was that I've never been really on the West Coast. I lived in San Diego, obviously, but that's it. And so I think that that's really cool to be in a completely different place than I've ever been and experience that culture. So I'm very excited about that aspect for me personally. I think just in terms of logistics, we've talked a lot about finances. Even though I don't think necessarily that you're paid enough in the States, the minimum in the NWSL and the USL Super League is around 35, 36,000. Yep. That's not enough, but that is so much more than you will make overseas. As Abby and I have said, we're those middle tier players. So I think that was a really big draw for me just in terms of wanting to continue my career, but really struggling financially. I've been very open on the podcast. I really struggle financially to do this, which is so aggravating because Abby and I both have great degrees, undergrad degrees. I have a master's, and my mom and I really go back and forth about this all the time, that I'm doing this to myself. Like, I don't need to be in this position, but because of the love of the game, I'm willing to be. So that's like a massive draw for me to be back in the States. My family, they're great. They've always been supportive. They'll come. I'm excited to play in Brooklyn. I feel like our away games might end up having more fans. Like, a lot of the girls on the team have a lot of people on the East Coast. So I think that's really exciting. And it's really fun to be a part of something new. Like, you have no idea what's going to come from this league, but just the opportunity is amazing, because obviously when I started, this wasn't a thing. So even just having some teammates who are fresh out of college and they're stepping into this environment, I'm so grateful to be a part of something for them that's probably loads better than what it was for players like me, even Abby's year, the year before that. So being a part of something like that is actually, like, not to be like super emotional, but it is like, it just feels like I'm a part of something that's going to change how people view women's professional soccer.
Every player announcement that's made in the Super League, I like to credit myself with having a few ounces of intuition and just reading between the lines of like the social media discourse from these players. It feels like measurable, the relief, the joy for a lot of these players to have an opportunity, or for a lot of these players that have come home that were playing abroad in some of these less than ideal circumstances that we've talked about. Quick clarification. I said Josh McAllister. I'm still getting used to, we have a head coach, Joe Johnson. So shout out Joe Johnson and Josh McAllister and Gareth Smith. If you're listening to this, there's this woman that Sydney and I know. Her name's Abby Carchio. She's pursuing her Wave B license. Let's go. We gotta manifest this.
Oh, I appreciate it, guys. I appreciate it. No, it's I've got a lot to learn, but I'm eager to impact the women's game. So whenever anyone's ready, I'm always ready to do my duty and serve the game.
But as a player, this league really just signifies like opportunity, even beyond a player, right? Like, even coaches, like Joe was not in the professional realm before this, and now like you're a professional head coach. So it's just like the opportunity overall in this league for investors, for coaches, for players, for sponsorships. Like, all of this stuff is just such an amazing, amazing thing that we were a bit critical of in the beginning. Like, we were like, why wouldn't the USL Super League be the second division? Why wouldn't you have promotion relegation? Now that we're kind of in it, it's like, oh, wow, like, you're really trying to do something right from the jump. And that's really exciting.
Totally. And I don't think it can be discounted that players are investing with the most precious of resources, their time,
for sure,
their energy, their bodies. So I think what I've witnessed so far before a ball has been kicked, it just seems like there's a level of stoke that I don't even think I anticipated as somebody who's been pretty upbeat and bullish about both the League One team that's playing in Spokane, but of course looking forward to the USL Super League team that's going to play in Spokane. I want to end on a little bit of a goofy thing. I'll preface this by saying Abby and I, as everyone knows who's listened to the announcement that's been made on the Instagram page, if you haven't heard it, or if you don't follow the Instagram page, you might not know this, but we're going to be doing profiles of every player that's been signed for Spokane Zephyr FC. We're going to be talking a little bit about the league itself and looking at some other clubs and coaches. Many of these players and coaches, Abby will recognize. We'll get a chance to talk about her former college teammate, Sydney Cummings. That will be super fun. So watch out for those episodes of this podcast. But talk to me a little bit as a final closing note about the style of play you hope to see, anticipate, etc. Because we're not going to do this now because this would go 3 more hours. I know how you two get when you talk about tactics and football. I know how I get as someone who, let's be clear, I just want to really make sure that listeners know this. The two of you will forget like an hour after this podcast more about this sport than I know in my entirety. I listen to your podcast and I'm like, holy crap, I'm writing things down. It's awesome to listen to professionals talk about this sport. But that said, I know we share a lot of similar perspectives about how the sport should be played. The term direct and transitional comes up a lot on my podcast when talking about American soccer. So what do you hope to see in this league? And and what do you expect to see? Let's start with you, Abby, and then we'll close with Sydney, who's going to be playing in this league.
Oh, this is an exciting one, and I'm going to try and keep it succinct and concise.
I know
But
it's a heavy question. I'm sorry.
we have so many players coming back from overseas, and so I'm excited to see the influences of those clubs come in, specifically the patience from the defenders. I am curious to see how that translates in terms of in possession. How do the defenders move, and what does their rest defense look like?
Yeah, I think for me, I want this league to look really different than the NWSL. And I feel like we talk a lot about the NWSL being super direct, super transitional. And I think that this provides a great space for players who don't fit that mold to find a home somewhere in the US outside of the NWSL. I think inevitably that's going to happen. Like that's football. Even when we watch, in England, you have moments of directness. Like that's a tactic, right?
Yeah,
But I
for
think
sure.
as an overall general concept, what I'm hoping for this league is that it continues to separate itself from the NWSL to give players the chance to really see what they like better and what is more their playing style so that it becomes a choice. If it ends up being like a sister of the NWSL where it's exactly the same, I feel like then players are still stuck in the same boat. But I think just based off of the logistics that the league has put forward to not have a draft, to be matched with the European calendar, like they've already set themselves up for success to be different. So I'm hoping the playing style goes with that. And every team will be different. So I'm also looking forward to the different identities of every team, specifically ours.
Yeah, of course. I mean, this has come up on my podcast. It came up in a recent conversation where I got to chat with the coach of the men's team, Lee Viedman, and 3 players. And it was one of the first things I asked about was what those terms mean, direct and transitional. And it's very obvious by the way that Lee Viedman answered that question that he's not a big fan. But again, you're right. Sometimes tactically, you just go, you know what? Let's hoof it a few times. Let's play some 4-4-2, a little blood and thunder. But it shouldn't be the norm, and it's, I think, a treat. This is not new information to people who listen to this podcast and have listened to it a lot. But it's really fun to watch, quote unquote, proper football being played. And I hope we've seen examples of that in USL's League One, specifically with velocity. We have a lot of possession. We don't like to give the ball away for no reason. That's a great way to end this podcast. I can't wait. This is so close. August 17th, first game. We host Fort Lauderdale here in Spokane at One Stadium. We get to see Sydney Cummings play football, play soccer. The whole football soccer thing, I say soccer all the time. I don't really care. I love this video that's going around of these 2 English women talking about, I forget the name of the podcast that they're doing, but they're talking about the history of that term. And the term was a shortened version of association football. And they shortened association to ASOC, and then they added that felt weird. So they then added and just said soccer. So that's how the term soccer is actually English. And then they ended up dropping the use of it in like the 1930s or something like that. So it's pretty funny. All the dunking that Americans receive for saying soccer, or Australians or South Africans, it's like, hey, English, you actually started this.
That's hilarious.
It's actually so funny about this. Just a quick little side bit. So my mom is probably like one of our number 1 fans of Megged. Like she listens to it all the time. She's so sweet. And Abby and I were talking one time and I could hear my mom on a work call and she was chatting and she said, oh yeah, like my daughter plays football, blah, 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 blah. And I literally called Abby and I was like, Abby, like if nothing else, we just succeeded in life. Like my mom just called soccer football and like we can rest now. Like let's retire on this note. Because the woman that she was speaking to was like, your daughter plays football? And she was like, oh, no, sorry. My daughter plays soccer. Oh, sorry. She's just been playing overseas. And I was literally listening and I was like, yeah, mom.
You got her. Yeah.
Oh, well done. So that's so funny. Like Abby and I have completely transitioned now and we just like go back and forth between the 2 terms.
It reminds me a little bit about, as someone who went to film school, I would never say, although there was probably a time where I would use the term film, my favorite films. And I might even use an English accent when I would do it. What are your favorite films? And it's like, now they're movies. It's fine. They're movies. It's kind of similar to me. I don't know why, but now I lean into saying soccer. I feel like there's an antagonistic side of me that loves that it seems to piss off British people. But anyway, I digress. Thank you both, Abby Carchio, Sydney Cummings. This has been amazing. It's been, I hope everybody appreciates this episode of this podcast as much as I have. And next up is going to be Abby and I breaking down player profiles of Spokane Zephyr FC. So until that podcast comes up, thank you all for listening. As always, be sure to go to Instagram and follow our page, and be sure to rate and review on whatever podcast platform you use. All right. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks, Benji.
Thanks so much for having us, Benji. I'm really excited to listen to your guys' show.